It's a big subject, but it's also a subject that I think so many people spend a lot of time thinking about in a granular way that it almost becomes quite disconcerting to actually think about somebody who, myself, yourself, others, are awakened, aware, switched on, lucid, however you want to describe it, perhaps even coming from a business background and then going on this spiritual journey, having like epiphanies and tools and picking up gifts and abilities that can help others, and then bringing that back into a sustainable business model. I mean, if that's the overshooting the overview of what we're going to be talking about today, from my perspective, that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, let's just start with a little bit of background. Do you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, well, I can talk about my background, but maybe rather than it being generic, I'm going to relate it to the subject matter in
Yes.
terms of uh, perhaps about how I was brought up in terms of class and culture and
Mm,
my relationship to education, because all of those things are formative about how you view money and success, because I think that's what we're going to circle around to. That, as you say, with having developed kind of spiritual journey, that presently I'm encountering being an entrepreneur for the first time. I mean, we will explore the corporate world and the freelance world and so on, but um, it was a very odd thing for me to, with spiritual intentions and ideas of serving, because I've started a meditation business. The whole kind of ethical aspects of money and so on, it seemed a real kind of clash, and I was happy to discover there are people out there like ourselves who are beginning to engage with that and think, no, how can we do this in a really fresh way that we feel comfortable with and can still serve and still
mm,
make a living? So yeah, I think fundamentally our attitudes towards what money and success is very much grounded in how we're brought up. I mean, our parents or our guardians or carers, depending on what environment we were brought up on, have a fundamental effect on us, and had a fundamental effect on me. And I was brought up in a very working class background in the East End of Glasgow in the 1970s. Nice. And it was a difficult area, difficult time. But my parents, uh, we always felt, even though we're in a very difficult area, it turned out at one point that particular area had fallen below Naples as being the poorest area in Europe at that particular time in the 70s. So it's a real badge of honour. It's just chucked that in there. You turn into the Four Yorkshiremen of Monty Python about who's going to outdo who with their background. But
oh
I
my
only
God.
laterally discovered that. But when
Yeah.
you're in the midst, when you're in the midst of it, when you're in the midst of it, you can only see it.
No different.
What's around you, and so on. So for me, my dad was a labourer. My mum worked in a sometimes part-time a sausage factory or in a shop or something like that. And for me, I had a uniform, went to church every Sundays, Catholics and stuff like that. And we felt kind of respectable. We had Sunday best clothes. And to me, we were living a good life. It was fine. I mean, it was later I discovered that compared to other places, it was like very difficult. But the fundamental thing, where the economic thing would come in straight away, was that it's the difference between having a wage and having a salary. I didn't realize it again at the time, because everyone I knew had wages, and people worked from Friday to Friday and got through everything. And that was a success. That was the measure for me of being successful. It was like you survived from week to week and life was good. And every year we had enough money to go and visit my grandmother, my granny, in Donegal and Ireland, and we had summer holidays. So for me, we were doing okay. So my parents lived from week to week and worked. They would give me a real work ethic. My dad was a real hard worker. He was a hard labourer. Had to deal with really heavy labouring job, and I saw how early he left in the morning, how tired they came back in the evening. So they kind of instilled in me a kind of a work ethic. But what was very different about those times, and it was a long time ago, and it's something we can talk about further, is I didn't have the influence of social media. I think the difference is these days that people can see on the gram, the kind of what they can't have and the lifestyle that they're missing out on and the events they're missing on. I was brought up at a time where I could live in that bubble and I didn't realize how successful or how little money we did have because we couldn't see it so clearly. I was got interested in documentaries at a young age. I watched your television a lot to understand the world, and that's something I eventually went into. But so in terms of success and money and so on, I was brought up in the bubble, and I had a very low expectation, in that respect of what success was.
Hmm.
We didn't have that middle class pressure that your brother or sister or auntie was a doctor, a dentist, or a lawyer, and all that kind of pressure. That's a different kind of pressure. I didn't have that pressure. It was more like we need to survive. You need to find a way.
Yeah, I can speak to some of that, and I think that there's some nice differences between us. I grew up in a leafy suburb of London, northwest London, in a place called Barnet. And we lived on a council estate for the first 11 years of my life, but we lived in the middle of sprawling fields and oak trees. But just up the road at the top of the lane was where all the red brick townhouses were. And then a little bit further up is where all the mansions were. So I grew up with I was a very observant little girl and I read very widely. So I was reading early and I read a lot of literature, most of which was, I would describe as 1920s, 1950s literature, which is always aimed at middle class, upper class readers. So I had a very keen social sense of, okay, this is how I'm living, and I accept it. I'm in a family. I go to school. And then I was seeing all these like other levels or layers, and I was just always keenly observant and aware as to what made the difference. So, for example, I would listen to accents. I would listen to the same London accent as it was spoken by a working class person, as opposed to, say, my middle class teacher, as opposed to a visiting professor who came to our school who perhaps had gone to Cambridge. And I remember keenly knowing that I had the ability, according to who I was with, to become something else, someone else. There was that ability, and I knew that education, literature, books were one of the avenues that I could take. But at the same time, I was deeply, deeply troubled and disturbed by the fact that there was just this, as you say, this bubble. And at the same time, we went to church, our equivalent of church in our religious community. So we would go once a week, sometimes twice, three times a week. And what I heard in church, and this kind of mixes in with your framework for money and business and success and spirituality, is that if you're virtuously spiritual, you don't think about money. You do it for the righteousness of it. You do it voluntarily, because most of our church was run by donations and voluntary, so it was a non-profit approach to spirituality. But if you wanted to be successful and businesslike and run around in a Rolls Royce, there was almost this judgment, the rich man can't enter the kingdom of heaven. And I do believe that we soak up, as Bruce Lipton talks about with epigenetics and early childhood, we do the first 7 years, we soak up all these programs, and they don't just go away as we go through life and perhaps make our own paths through life. They kind of go under the radar and they seep down under your field of vision, but they're always there somehow way informing you. So yes, working class, very strong work ethic, which I have, to the point where I have to be really careful that I don't overwork. Very serious attitudes towards pleasure. We saw a lot of people, you know, maybe not working as hard in our environment, and then there was always the cautionary tale there. You don't want to end up like those people. So learning to
Mhm.
have the right balance of relaxing and so on and so forth. But we always had shoes on our feet, we always had new bags, we always had uniforms to go to school, and I was raised religiously, and I do want to make that difference. And I think with Catholicism too, you get um, that extra input about education and ethics and values that I think are very informative and can actually inform the rest of your working life. So I do take the best of my background at the same time as owning that it's been quite a journey to migrate from a council estate where we didn't even have a library. We had a van that would come around once a week with books checked out to where I'm currently and how I'm currently living. It's almost a little sometimes, dreamlike. So there's definitely overlap. And I thank you for sharing your story. I think, Glasgow, London, I mean, there is some overlap there. Um, what kind of school did you go to? What was your school like?
Um, Yeah, the school was local, it was an ordinary primary school. And yeah, the Catholicism aspect of it was big because I became an altar boy. I was a very well
Oh,
behaved boy.
wow.
I was a very nice boy. And very holy. And but basically that the Catholicism taught me show business. Because, the lights, the stained glass, the smoking handbag. There's a really disproportionate amount of people who were brought up Catholic who go into theatre and into film, into media because of that performance aspect. And
Mm.
I remember being released early from class, even as a 7, 8 year old, to go and do the school mass and go early and get dressed, put the kit on and everything. And it felt really exciting. Then you go, da da, and walk on with walking on a big candle. And it's all very dramatic. And
Oh, wow.
that had a really big impact on me. That to me felt
Yeah.
like that was my first
That
contact
was
for me.
showbiz.
Show
Yeah.
business. Yeah, yeah. And the beautiful, I'd call them costume. The garments were, beautifully made. The fabrics and everything. It was astonishing kind of
Oh,
level of
yeah.
theatricality, and ritual as well, which is a big part of theatre. And
Yes. Yes.
so in that respect, I liked what you said about perhaps taking the best out of it that I could, because it did give me um, my first sense of spirituality as well. I mean, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, I did leave the Catholic Church in my late teens, but the residues of it stayed with me, and that's when I, as an altar boy, remember, a hazy summer's evening in church with six little coughing old ladies doing benediction. And I just had this moment where the light was streaming through the stained glass window and the dust was rising up, and the smell of the incense and the hum of the priest speaking at that time still in Latin, actually.
Cinematic, isn't it?
Well,
It's
yeah, but it gave me that
yeah.
sense of,
Mm,
yeah, well, that's how I visualize it. So, and
mm.
that's what happened. And um, it gave me a sense of otherness, of something behind, below, above what I was experiencing. And that was one of my first breakthroughs as a child, of sensing of something more. And Catholicism gave me that. I mean, for all its faults, and it has many, many faults, as Hermann Hesse said, he loved the concept of the hierarchy and the power of the Catholic Church, which he kind of used in the glass bead game when he won the Nobel Prize. He used that as a kind of template. But he says when you get up too close, you can smell the power in the blood. And that's the thing with it, the idea of spirituality being a way to reach the divine, but religion's about control and being able to see the
Yes.
difference. So I look back, fondly with many of the things there. But you're right about perhaps actually bringing a humbleness and maybe a lack of materialism, um, about aspiring to having money. But things change. We're talking about education. Things changed in my secondary school. There was a point where I think they still had a kind of 11 plus type thing, and my best friend, me and him, always got the same marks, and this was a real fork in the road.
It's a
Um,
crossroads for British kids.
100%. And
Mm.
my mum and dad didn't know the system, but his brother had gone to this great school in Glasgow called St Mungo's. And that was in the all boys school. That's the school to go to. And I lost my best friend. He went there, and I get chucked into this like jungle of secondary
Comprehensive.
school, which
Hmm.
was, really tough, run
Hmm.
run by gangs, and you know, and a couple of vicious Maris brothers who used to give everyone, it's corporal punishment in those days. And that was a massive wake up call in that respect. But being working class, my way out was, for a lot of people, it was through sport. So people dreamed of being like, boxers or athletes. And for a lot of people, it
Yeah.
was
Buddy
football.
and yeah.
Yeah. And so for me, Jacqueline, my fantasy for a little while was that my way to get out of my background, once I began to realize it was quite stifling and quite limited, was that it
Mm.
was going to be football. And it was the reason that I wasn't bullied at school. That basically, I'd be, a good target for it, but I was useful for football. And then
Yeah.
I ended up playing for Celtic Boys Club. I got some trials, then started playing for them. So I had a kind of fantasy for about a year, 18 months that maybe this was the way out. But then I kind of, deep down realized it wasn't for me and that education might be the way out. But the funny thing said about reading, although it became, a major, major part of my life, up until I was about 16, 17, I had no books in the house. I didn't do much reading at all. And it was almost like after I left school, that I started then voraciously reading stuff for myself. So I didn't really have that literature didn't inform me in the same way it did later on. It was
Mm.
very much television. That was my thing. So yeah, the
Yeah.
education is difficult, very difficult, non-supportive environment. I lived in a very small house. I had no space to do kind of homework. The place was cold very often in the winter, and
No.
yeah, it was
No.
difficult obstacles in the way of having a good education.
There's a lot to unpack there. So I don't want to just tiptoe all over what you've just said,
Sure.
because I think people watching this are going to, I think, resonate and identify in so many different ways. And I want to go back to something that you said before about the cinematic or the theatrical, the ritualistic beauty, sensory beauty, the transcendence of the Catholic ceremonies. And I think that children, before you get to about 10, when you do that crossroads, and in England we go to a comprehensive school, you go to a private school or a grammar school, and it really is the sorting out for the rest of your young adult life. But before I get there, I want to go back. If you're listening to this and you have a story about your background, all right, whatever that narrative is, I invite you to go back transcendently and look through the eyes of a young child, because a young child, we don't filter out the glimmers. We young children, if you watch them, will make the paradise out of the most hellish or most difficult of situations. They don't realize that their house is too small. They don't realize that their options are limited. They will look for the glimmers, and so that part of you is always there. And I want to say that there are always portals, gateways, pathways out that any one of us at any point can take. And for me it was literature, for me it was books. And then for you, Neil, obviously you created these other pathways that led on ultimately to the main pathway. In terms of 11, everything became institutional for me. I was put into, there were no other options available to me but to go into comprehensive school. And I'll tell you what happened to me. So with you with the soccer, etc., and that way out. I was just talking about this today with my community, so it's interesting that it's coming up for me. I went to this school. Nobody knew me. I wore National Health plastic glasses. I was a little geek. I was short, hair in bunches, a fish out of water. Very intimidated, and very quickly was bullied, targeted, bullied. And anyone who's been to a working class council estate comprehensive school knows it's the school of hard knocks. It's very, very rough. It can be, even with the best teachers. So I immediately turned into class clown. I decided that I didn't, sports wasn't available to me. I was too nerdy. Nobody had any sense of me being anything to do with books or the library. That wasn't an option. So I realized that the only way to survive and to thrive in a very chaotic, dysfunctional environment, which was comprehensive school, was to be class clown. And I became, so I want to speak to you, to your pathway too, because I became an entertainer. I put on a persona. And when I look back, I have nothing but admiration for this really cheeky little thing. But of course, it caused no end of problems, and it cost me at least somewhat of an education. So I went, by the time I got to the end, and I left at 16. Neil, I didn't stay on. I had, very few qualifications to speak of, CSEs back in the day, not even O levels. And I immediately was thrust into what our working class parents would say, well, now you got to go earn your keep, right? You're 16, you got to go and earn your keep. So what do? You go down the job center and you start to look at your options. And so for quite a few years, it was one dead end service job led to another. But before I get to that early career stuff, I'd like to just stick with the whole institutional thing. Do you
Yeah.
want to talk a little bit, Neil? I mean, I know this world, but maybe for our audience, which is mostly American, do you want to talk about the institutionalizing effect of a British comprehensive working class system, school system on people?
Yeah, can do. I just wanted to, in case I forgot, I had those nerdy NHS specs as well. And actually, I became an entertainer as well. Uh, how I learned maths was tables, was that we had corporal punishment, and I had a list of that going down the X and Y axis. I had a list of the name of teachers. I had graphs of the number of times I was belted by people, and it was all to do with misbehaving in class through boredom, through the fact that I was quite anarchic some of the classes and it was hard to concentrate. It was never really anything malicious. So I do identify with that aspect that and that continued through in terms of my life, in terms of humor and getting into television and stuff. So yeah, that again, that was formed out of the fire of difficulty. Isn't that funny? Some of the great,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, there was conventionality in those days. Like you said, at that age 11 or 12, the caste system was almost sorted out. The caste system was sorted out, where
Mm.
you'd end up slotted into this, and it'd be there was a lack of social mobility, which still carried on from the 1950s and so on. Again, those tectonic plates were moving around at a young age, and I had no idea about them really. And my mum and dad didn't know how to work the system. So my
No.
best friend and his brothers went off to this more privileged school, and I ended up in a different place. And although what was different about it was our school was mixed. So we realized that girls were human beings as opposed to these odd boys schools who obviously that
Yeah.
brought its own social.
Hormones kicking.
Exactly. So that brought his own social dysmorphia, all these boys not meeting the
Mm.
girls. So I didn't regret that in that respect. But yeah, there was educate. One thing that struck me was uh, I liked education. I mean, the thing was, I was always did well at school, and I kind of got good O levels. But then when it came to getting the highest to go to university, I kind of blew it. I kind of met my first girlfriend, had my first love, and that kind of went all wrong. I got chucked, frankly, just before my
I
exams.
can't believe it, Neil.
Yeah, well, it does happen. Basically that kind of put me in flux a bit. I couldn't get to university, and I kind of lost my way. It took me till my early 20s to get back on track and get to university. But after that, I did lots of other things which we can talk about, which I do not
Yeah. How old
regret.
were you when you went to university? Because
I was
usually
about
you go at 18, don't you, in
Yeah,
the
when I was
UK?
about 24, 25, but by that time, I'd got involved in the theatre, working in the theatre, and also I worked with children. I did childcare, kids with a severe epilepsy, and then also worked in a hospital with people who are paraplegic and quadriplegic, because I thought I was going to go down the caring route, as it were, just to discover it's good for a while, but not for 30 years. I thought, I'm a nice
Yeah.
person, but I can't
Yeah.
do this my whole life. I found
Yeah.
my
No.
limit. But it was basically school. I didn't find a love of literature, and so until I really until I left, I kind of endured school. I never played for the school team because it was run by gangs. I played for Celtic Boys Club. Never played for my school because we would go to difficult areas, really difficult areas in East End of Glasgow, and you needed basically protection. And I was doing a trial for the school team, and I made a mistake, and the person on my team said he was going to stab me after the trial. He's in
Oh
my
God.
team. I thought,
Right.
I tell you what, I'm going to leave this. I'm not going to
Mm.
bother playing for the school team. So school was to be endured, although I kind of deep down had a love of education. I remember Pink Floyd brought that song out, We Don't Need
Oh
No
yeah.
Just Another Brick in the
Mm.
Wall. And I actually didn't like it. I should have been, yeah, revolting, going anti-school, but I didn't actually feel that. And there was maybe a bit of me that was deep down,
Academic.
yeah, and a little bit conservative about the idea of ripping down all of that. I could see the value in it, and I didn't feel rebellious in that way. So, um, yeah, so school was to be endured. It did program you because, as you know, the bells that ring every hour on the hour to move to different places and so
Mm.
on, that they were originally used in factories to get people
Yes,
to
it's
come
all it's
into their room.
factory settings, isn't it? It's
But very
factory.
much,
You punch in,
yeah,
you punch out. I mean, we were
exactly.
we were prepared for working class life, which just to give people a background, I think that we were talking about the 80s when it was still very much this way round, believe it or not, not so much now, but you really were kind of pointed towards factories, or being a plumber, electrician if you were a guy. If you were a girl, basically it was secretarial work, factories and shop work. You know, there was just no other. Oh, you could go to university, or you could do this, you could do that. You really, and nobody had the. People just thought you had to go to work. You had to leave school and go to work because you would have to leave your home because it was often a very small family home,
Yeah,
and you'd have to pay your rent. And suddenly you find in yourself you're paying your rent, you're buying food, groceries, and you've got to make do, and you try to do the best you can. And it was a better economy, I think, than it is now. But it's very much, yeah, it was very much engineered towards class and class mentality. I want to
yeah,
say, though, as well, that I think that we were held to very high standards, less so than today. And I think that education for most mobility, it is about education. So I do believe in public education. I'm not one of these people that if I had enough money, I'd send my kids to a private school. I do believe that we should fund good education and bring the right environments in together. But I'm going off on a tangent. So tell me, so university, I went to university at 26, Neil, just letting you know. At 24, I went back to night school. I was working in a shop. I'm a former shop girl. And I paid for my own A levels. So I got my A levels and then I went and applied to some universities. And I went, it was like Educating Rita, that movie. I went when I was
yes, yes.
26.
I love
And
that movie.
as soon as I walked in, because it was a polytechnic, so it was one of those brand new labor run polytechnics because they wanted to drive working class people into universities, and at that time we had grants, which was a huge deal
Yeah,
to
I
get
had
a
to go.
grant to go to
Mm.
university, which I think is fantastic. So I went to this polytechnic, and because it had the funding, it was the right time to go, because what they were able to do is they were able to lure in from all of the top British universities some of the best professors in the country. So I say for the 3 years that I was studying English literature when I was in hog heaven, I got some of the best teachers that were available to me. And it was such a juxtaposition to where I'd come from that it kind of struck me that I would never again settle for anything less than a lifelong learning path, whatever that looked like. So it's interesting that we were both considered, adult students, although we were
Yeah,
both still young. What
yeah,
did you
because
study?
well, I studied at the University of Glasgow, and I studied film and media and theatre studies. And there's a couple of things going on there. First of all, um, University of Glasgow turned into what they now call as one of those Russell Group universities, is one of those top universities, which had happened just after that. And I was, very fortunate to get in. I worked really hard. I did evening. I was working. I did 3 nights a week to get my hires. And I remember I got my two A's and a B, and I did three A's. Film and media was this new groovy kind of subject. And
Yes.
I actually phoned up and I got hold of this wonderful lecturer, as it turned out, and explained my passion and love of television and all the stuff that I'd done. And she let me in. And that's how I got. And I've had made that phone call. It's one of the news courses. But yeah, that was. I felt I had to go to university because. Um, I had done other jobs that were interesting. I had worked, as I say, in theatre and childcare and working in a hospital as well, and all that was good. But I just hadn't found my way. I thought I do have to have a complete education. By that time, between about 17, 18 and 24, 25, I read the most I've ever read in my life. I
Mm,
completely demolished the high literature. And also what I was working through, and this is an important thing, was I was always intimidated by high culture. so
mm,
that so that at school we were taught Shakespeare and Keats, and I love Keats, and I enjoyed Shakespeare as well. But I thought I had my first breakthrough creatively to feel like I might be different. Another way out of this, my background was maybe through writing. But I felt I couldn't find a voice. I didn't see any value about writing about my working class life. I didn't have any examples of it. It was like if I don't like write like Dickens, what's the point kind of feeling. I was very intimidated by that. And then it was about 19, I was, me and a couple of other people won this national playwriting competition for the Scottish Youth Theatre. And that's when I had a recognition of, oh, hang on, I might be different. I might have something special. And I did the classic thing where I'd been working in the theatre. I took a year out. I thought, I'm going to become a writer, still at
Hmm.
home. My mum and dad going, where's the rent? All that kind of stuff. So, but I thought I'll become an artist. And I read the most I've ever read in a year, but I made the mistake, and this is to anyone out there who wants to do any kind of art or any kind of particularly writing, was I made the mistake of reading all the great writers while I was writing, which completely crushed me because I was reading
Yes.
like Thomas Mann and Goethe and all that, and me trying
Yeah.
to write a little, play about my life, and I'm thinking, what's the point? And it crushed my spirit. So then one of the big tips was do not read that kind of reading when you're doing your own creative work. Make
You need to
space
hear your voice.
in
Yeah.
your own voice. Again, no one told me that. And again, a big part of this working class aspect too, and coming through secondary school, trying to find your own spirituality as well as your creativity. I had no mentors. I never had anyone that
E-
took me under my
Exactly.
wing. Whereas I think in a different environment,
Yeah.
more middle class, is always someone, well, either an
Yes.
uncle, auntie who's a professional or someone who would take you under the
Yes.
wing and see potential in you. I never got any of that at all.
No.
So anything I've done, and I say it, I don't say it, it's not like a big boast, but anything I've done, I've completely done myself with no help. I had to find my own way. No, I'm not saying once you go into various places, people don't help you, but in terms of my big breaks, in terms of pushing through, never had any advantage, never had any cultural capital to kind of push me forward.
I want to just applaud that and sharing that as well, because one of the things when I look back on my struggling self, teenage 20s, 30s, I think there were no reference points. There was no pathway, no modeling out of this. I did it all by trial and error. And much like yourself, I mean, I got published by Random House when I was in my 20s, and I literally put in my diary. This is another thing. We sometimes, when we have these trajectories from a very working class background, or it's just, there's nobody around us that we know, all of our friends are doing what everybody else is doing in the community, you can sometimes get a little bit unrealistic and fantastical. So I wrote in my diary when I got, and it was a group competition, poetry competition. I'm the next W.H. Auden, because of course I was reading W.H. Auden at the time, and it infected all of my writing. So I read like Virginia Woolf in a lot of my early writing, but you
Yeah,
don't have you don't have anything to kind of gauge or judge yourself by, do you? You
no,
really are flailing in a lot of senses, but there's an audacity that comes through. And then you're right, the spirituality, we haven't even really touched on that. You've got this creativity running parallel with being a young adult, all the relationships, going to work and everything else. And then this
yeah,
spiritual awakening that's happening tandem alongside it. Can you speak to that a little bit? Did you have spiritual
yeah.
awakenings along the
Yeah,
way?
I'll come to I'll come to what you just raised a thought there. For
Mm,
me, where I saw working class voices, as it were, creatively, was in
hmm.
those classic 1950 films like Look Back in Anger, The Sporting Life, all those things about Albert Finney set in the North and so on.
Yeah.
And through film, I saw heard working class voices, started to hear, stories about working class. But I thought, well, there must be a way of being able to write about those lives now. That was a massive breakthrough. Everything was
Mm,
that culture. So, but I didn't, that also it made my interest in theatre as well. So I started going to theatre. That was a big breakthrough for me as well.
hmm.
Um, so yeah, so trying to discover a working class voice rather than feel like you've got to be the next bloody, Shakespeare. It's like
Yeah.
that was began to hear other voices, and that was liberating. Another big thing as well that happened as well, where I never felt okay. There's an imposter syndrome. Everyone's got imposter syndrome these days. Even people who are very privileged. It's very fashionable. Most of you don't earn it out there. Honestly, proper imposter syndrome. I wrestled with some of that, but however, I was always quite proud of being working class. I was always quite thought I'm from a good community. I know my background. I know my Irish roots because I've always felt more Irish than Scottish, even though people will be hearing my Glasgow accent. My whole family, my whole genetics is 100% Irish. And then my
Mm,
where I began to zoom out, the biggest experience I had to kind of zoom out was I met a posh girl. I got myself a posh girlfriend, and posh to our American friends means probably high class. And she lived in Glasgow. She was English, and her father was in the army and stuff like that. And I met her at college. We were in a play together, obviously acting. And but she took me to a part of Glasgow I'd never been to, and she brought me into this enormous house. And when she was babysitting, she was in houses where they had a grand piano.
mm.
Now that was my Instagram moment
Exposure.
because
Hmm.
I'd seen obviously documentaries and television about other, you know, aspects of life, but I'd never seen it. And now the thing that struck me, and this is a massive thing where my pride of being working class and what drove me through my teens into my twenties was, rather than being intimidated by it, I saw that I could speak to her mother and father about arts and the theatre and films I'd seen and stuff I couldn't speak to my mum and dad about. They just thought it was gay, basically. He wants to get into the theatre. He's doing a bit of acting. Here
Oh
we
yeah.
go. So, but they were fine. My parents, they didn't really understand any of that. So, basically, but what I did see in that household was there wasn't a lot of love. There was a lot of distance between them. So the last thing my girlfriend would feel like talking to her parents about is bloody art because they didn't talk about much. It was kind of there was love, but there was a lot of distance and space, and then I go back to this tiny little house full of my Irish mum and dad, and I
There's
felt
a lot of
such
love.
love. I
Mm,
felt such, I thought, God, I'm loved, you know.
yeah.
And I thought, I've got the rest of the world to talk to about art. I'm okay. My mum and dad love me. I was about 17, and that was massive for me because then I went, right, things just clicked into place.
Wow.
And that really grounded me. And I thought, right, I'm working class, I'm proud of it. The people who have these great lives, with appears to have this, much more wealthy life, doesn't mean they're happy. All that I experienced it rather than it being a political concept as well. So
Yeah.
that was massive for me. So yeah, to bring in the spirit, so I wanted to speak to that. So
Yeah.
spiritually, I had that experience as an altar boy, but also when I was about a couple of years later, when I was about 10, I had the experience just walking through um, a local public park where I just popped up and went, "Oh, I'm here." I had that feeling of just some self-awareness that I'm alive, I'm here, and it's that self-consciousness. And it wasn't where you lose childhood and become self-conscious, it was that self-awareness that why am I here rather than not being here? Why have I popped out of nothing? Didn't have the terminology like popping out of nothingness, but I had this feeling of, oh my God, and ever since then, I always had that feeling of I don't need to see someone walk on water. I don't need to see miracles. Like this is quite supernatural being here. So
I
that
love
was a
that.
that was a big breakthrough.
Yeah.
And then what happened was when I was about 17, 18, I had what I used to call I had a journal. Being very deep and sensitive, one has to have a journal. I was writing all this down. And basically, um, I was writing about my golden hours. I'd have these periods of a couple of hours, which looking back was I was just obviously having the terminology now. I was just fully present in the moment. I was walking, down the road and walking through places, and all the colours were brighter, and everything seemed sunny even when it wasn't. And then I'd come back, and then the door was slowly shut, and I'd go back into the shadow, and I'd go, "What the hell was that about?" Because that was great. How I thought
Yeah.
there must be a way of getting back there, and that, to cut a long story short, led me to meditation because then I found a technique that twice a day cleared my filters and I began to have my golden hours more naturally. It wasn't just random and sporadic. And that's when I started going on my spiritual path. I started to see a way of that whether you lived in a small working class house or lived in a mansion or whether you're making a cup of tea or looking over the Grand Canyon, all that
Yeah.
matters are your filters, how you're experiencing it. And that
Hmm.
was a massive breakthrough for me.
What age was that again?
I was about 17, 18. I started having what I call the golden hours, started feeling these moments. But then
Wow.
I learned it was transcendental meditation,
Mm.
which I continued to, after that. I did it for a further 30 years. I did that when I was 19. And and also what came out of that thing was I realized
Mm.
too I was a bit of a hippie. I kind of was never that materialistic. I was kind of like the kids these days. I was after experiences rather than things. I wasn't that interested in cars. I wasn't interested in getting a
Yeah,
mortgage in a house.
brands.
I just
No,
wanted to kind of live life a
me
bit,
too. Like a
that felt natural
gypsy.
to me. Yeah, I felt
Yeah.
very. I didn't have that fear factor of I'm skint and I'm working class. What am I going to do? I felt slightly fearless, like I just wanted to live life a little bit. So I don't know where that came from. Again, when you don't have the mentor and maybe you don't have their influences, although that seems like difficult, you know what it does, and you might identify with this. It does make it
Mm.
very clear where it's coming from, which is you. I mean, because I didn't have, I wasn't, so you have a purity of intent going, where did that come from? So I don't know if
That's a gift. That really is a gift. But I want to go back to again. There's so many beautiful golden moments here and glimmers. The audaciousness and that comes in with being authentic. And again, I want to draw people's attention back to the British class system. So when I went to university, and university is a melting pot, so you get a lot of people there that come from money that couldn't make it into Cambridge or Oxford or whatever because they just had their own emotional difficulties, but they were trust fund kids. So and you had wealthy foreign students. So suddenly, here you are in an academic environment where you're all kind of equal. Would you not say, Neil? It's fairly equal playing field. And here you are for the first time mixing with people from all different walks of life. And like yourself, I didn't have a very rich girlfriend, but I had best friends who were very, very wealthy. And what I quickly discovered, and this is something that's just stayed with me for the rest of my life. Whenever I went to a party or went anywhere in Britain, you ask where somebody went to school. It's one of the first questions. So where did you go to school? Because it very quickly pegs you in the class system, and it's just what British people
Yeah,
do. I don't know. It's the same in Scotland. And for the first few times, I made an absolute arse of myself by trying to somehow configure some mythical story about who I was. And at some point, I would always get found out, or something would slip, and it would be excruciating. And one day, my friend said to me, just be yourself. And I didn't have this wherewithal myself, Neil, so I applaud what you did. But she just said, just be yourself because you're enough. And so I started just to say, yeah, I went to a counselor, I lived on a counselor estate, went to this school and that school. And it just disarms people because they're meeting you where you're at and you've got things to talk about. And in fact, a lot of people that come from money are often quite deeply sensitized to the fact that they're privileged. Even back then in the 80s, there was a sense of being sensitized to privilege. And
yeah,
so you could form these really extraordinary, which is they're still my friends today, relationships, and that also informs your worldview because suddenly, all of a sudden, you're able to integrate into this world that's the greater world that's out there,
yeah.
and opportunities come on the horizon through that way. And when I came to America, it got even easier because it's less of an issue in the States. But so that authenticity, that audaciousness, that knowing that it only comes from yourself is rocket fuel. But
Mm.
anyone, if you're listening to this and you're in your 50s, 60s, 70s, or whatever situation you're in, at any moment you can pivot into being authentically you because you're enough. And I want to say, Neil, that what I'm hearing from you a lot of the time is that you see things very half, that the glass is half full as opposed to half empty, that you really you're able to distill the magic of your home life, which was very warm working class, as opposed to the austerity, emotional austerity that many of us have experienced when we've gone to our friends' houses and met their parents and
Yeah.
grandparents. It's almost sometimes quite sterile. Um, so yeah,
Yeah,
there's a lot of overlay there.
yeah, so we're looking at, obviously we're looking towards fundamentally what formed our views of what it was to be successful or materialistic or to have money. But there's various ways we're going through it. Well, we've talked about education, we've talked about our parents, but also what informed me as well was politics as well,
Mm.
because you start to see an overview of why are things like this and not a different way. So I obviously began to become really interested in left-wing politics. I've always been leaning to the left and liberal. Sorry, America. And basically, the a big part of that for me, where I was politicized, was 'cause my family was Irish,
Yes.
we used to get grief in Glasgow from various, places because of our Irish background, because the background of the Troubles in Northern Ireland and so on. There was
Yes.
no bombings in Glasgow, but there was a lot of sectarianism.
Yes.
So, I remember going for a job, trying to get a summer job in a factory. The first question I was asked was, "What school do you go to?"
Right.
Trying to place me. And I said, Saint blah blah. And they went, "That's a Catholic school. What are you doing here?" He said, "This is a Protestant factory." I mean, that's how blatant it was. So there
Yeah.
was massive sectarianism and strife, which was not as bad as Northern Ireland, but an expression of it because a lot of Irish immigration, and a big expression of Irish immigration was supporting Celtic, the team I was playing for as a boy, because that was very much about an immigrant class coming to. It could be like the Polish were in America, or it could be like
Mhm.
anything. We saw ourselves as very much the underdogs. We were looked down on very much by the Protestant establishment. There was a lot of discrimination, and which happened in Northern Ireland with the civil rights and so on. So I became
Mm.
very politicized through the Northern Ireland Troubles. I took great interest in the rise of the civil rights. I was young enough to actually old enough to remember the stuff in the late 60s with I did projects about that, about the rise of Martin Luther King and all this kind of stuff, and then the Vietnam War, seeing that on television as well, that highly. So I was also always interested in not just being
World event.
spiritual,
Mm.
there's a transcendent aspect to how you experience the world, but also concretely, yeah, but we live here, as an organism with people, and if we don't help people, they're going to be punished. It's very well living a sort of transcendental life, but what do we do when we're here to help people who are actually being thrown out of their houses, or as I used to say to my students, a lot of students these days not really interested in politics. I found a lot of them, they don't want nothing to do with it, maybe because it's toxic. But I say, do you care about how much your rent is, if you're paying council tax, where your
Mm.
clothes come from, are they from sweatshops? I said, everything's politics. So if you don't get involved,
Everything is. Yeah.
everything is. But if you don't get involved, don't complain then, but don't pretend nothing's connected. So that's something I continue to negotiate about, the spiritual aspect. The idea, again, coming back into business, is the perfect thing we're talking about, being a spiritual entrepreneur. Is that clash between politics, um, and business and the spiritual. That's obviously the sweet spot we're looking at, and a lot of that came from, again, my late teens, early 20s politics.
It was a very political time, though. I remember the
Yeah.
80s, and I mean, there was just so many things going on. I was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party at 16, giving out their newspapers, and very radicalized. But I do think a lot of that came from simply coming from a working class background. Politics. I want to bring in a little bit too. In the UK, we have like pub culture where people would come together, and it wasn't like people were looking at screens watching horse racing. People would have very robust political conversations. A lot of our
Mm.
fathers and uncles were members of unions, so it was a rich environment. And then to go to university, which is even more left wing in some respects for us during the 80s and 90s. So yeah, you're kind of bathed in that environment of questioning the paradigms that are out there, and also asking
Mm.
questions like, how can I be a part of a system, and how can I engineer change from within the system? Again, that's very empowering. Politics is a very powering entry point, isn't it,
Yeah.
into the kind of life that you want to create. And I think they are hand in glove with a spiritual awareness, with a consciousness. If you don't like that word spiritual, a consciousness, it's all intertwined, wanting to make the world a better place so that people have the same opportunities, like a meritocracy, genuine
Yeah.
meritocracy, is I think ingrained in us as working class. But I don't want to make this all about our particular backgrounds, because everybody's coming from different aspects and backgrounds. So
Yeah. I'm,
yeah,
I'm, I'm, ho- I'm hoping the examples that we're giving, although they're particular to us, that there's general principles there that people might be able to relate to in
yeah.
terms of those main thrusts of parental influence, education, politics, and so on. Because we all take different different things in different decades as well, because that's all a movable feast as well.
Absolutely. I think this feels like a really good place to stop.